Dom Manuel the Fortunate, King of Portugal, held an official audience in January 1497, and appointed as Admiral of the India fleet a tall, glittering young cavalier and nobleman about his own age, named Vasco da Gama. The Portuguese were now convinced that whatever country Columbus had discovered, it was not India. They would renew their attempts to reach India by their own route. 9 years had passed since Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope. By July 1497, 3 new ships had been built and equipped for the voyage. In the harbor of Lisbon, where the Tagus River meets the ocean, stood a small chapel built by Prince Henry the Navigator, dedicated to Our Lady of Bethlehem. All the night before sailing, Vasco da Gama was there praying with the other officers and with the monks from the nearby monastery. As the light of dawn came through the small windows, the Mass ended. The bells of the chapel and monastery rang. A procession emerged from the chapel, led by the vicar, followed by priests and monks chanting. Then came the admiral and 100 officers, each carrying a lighted candle. Lastly, the men of the crew, who had been waiting outside with friends and relatives, knelt to be given absolution, and joined the procession to the beach. There the women, wives, and mothers in black mantillas were weeping bitterly. 3 brand new ships, the Saint Gabriel, Saint Raphael, and the Berrio, were to make the voyage. Soon the anchors were weighed. Their great square sails, marked with bright red crosses, caught the brisk morning breeze, and they were off. This was a great adventure for Portugal. The voyage was to crown with success the 75 years of trial and error which had cost so much gold and the lives of so many men. Now, at last, the dreams of Prince Henry the Navigator, the efforts of his grandnephew John II, the perfect prince, were to be realized under John's cousin, King Manuel the Fortunate. At dawn on July 8, 1497, the day of sailing, Dom Manuel called his father confessor and before a number of witnesses made a solemn vow. In place of the small chapel at the harbor, he vowed to erect, if the voyage were a success, a splendid new cloister and chapel in memory of Prince Henry and dedicated to Our Lady of Bethlehem. The voyage began quietly. On July 26, the ships reached the Cape Verde Islands, stopped 8 days for food and water, fresh meat, and vegetables. They then turned eastward, sailed along the Guinea coast from which they swung far out towards the undiscovered coast of Brazil, then back again east and southeast, and on November 1st they came in sight of Africa again. 3 weeks later they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and anchored in Mossel Bay, where Bartholomew Diaz had landed 9 years before and been obliged to turn back. The men had then been on shipboard 4 months without proper food. Many of them were ill and dying of scurvy. Their gums had become sore, their noses bled, their skin turned greenish yellow and ulcerated. Their bodies swelled up with water, and they died in agony. In early January, the ships entered the mouth of the Zambezi River, and those who were well enough began digging graves for the 30 men who had died. The crew was heartened to know that they had now gone the greater part of the distance. By early March, they reached Mozambique. There in the harbor they saw Arab freighters returning from India. Their ships were made of planks sewn together with fibers, and had sails made of palm matting. That such frail ships could make the voyage was encouraging to the Portuguese. The 4 ships in the harbor were loaded with gold and silver, pearls and rubies, in spices, cloves, pepper, nutmeg, and ginger. For centuries, since 500 BC, the Arabs had controlled this trade with India, carrying products from the Far East to Alexandria and Egypt, where the ships from Venice and Genoa picked them up in exchange for goods from Europe. The Portuguese threatened this monopoly. At first, the Sheik of Mozambique had supposed that they were also Muslims, and Vasco da Gama, who wanted 2 pilots to guide him to India, let him continue to think so. When it was discovered they were Christians, no one in the harbor would even give them water. So da Gama turned the bombards on his ship towards land and fired stone balls at Mozambique's flimsy wooden fort for 3 hours. 2 days later he had all the water they needed and sailed north up the coast to Mombasa, the finest harbor on the East African shore. News of the coming of these hated foreigners had preceded them to Mombasa, and they had difficulty fighting off a night attack. But with good luck they escaped to the high seas and sailed north to Malindi. The Sheik of Malindi, they were happy to discover, was an enemy of the Sheik of Mombasa, and he gave da Gama a pilot to guide the Portuguese ships across the Indian Ocean, a very skillful pilot about 60 years of age. Ahmed ibn Mahid was his name. He wore a green turban, which was a sign that he was a Haji, one who had made the holy pilgrimage to Mecca. He had Vasco da Gama wait until the monsoons began to blow. Then the ships bearing their great red crosses were bellied out by the southern winds, and the ships of Don Manuel of Portugal were off on the last lap of their voyage. They were crossing the Indian Ocean. After the 23rd day, Ahmed, in his green turban, pointed out over the blue water, saying, "Here is the land to which you desired to go. We have arrived. We are just to the north of Calicut." At sunset, in the pink and green Indian evening of May 20th, 1498, the Portuguese reached the teeming docks of Calicut. The sea route to India was open. As they entered the harbor, many fishermen in small boats came close to inspect these 3 strange ships with red crosses on their sails. Then the fishermen hurried ashore to carry the news of the foreigners' arrival to the Raja of Cananor. The Raja called his soothsayers, who reminded him of an ancient prophecy, which said, "One day all India will be ruled by white men from a distant land, whose king will do great harm to those who are not his friends." Vasco da Gama had studied carefully all the information on India collected by King John. He knew that Calicut was the most important town on the whole of the Malabar coast. The Raja who ruled Calicut was called Zamarin, Lord of the Sea, and the Arab merchants of Calicut held great power in his kingdom. Some owned 50 or 60 ships, sailing back and forth with the monsoons to Africa. The Raja's main wealth came from the money the Arab merchants paid for his protection. As soon as the 3 ships were anchored in the harbor, Vasco da Gama sent a messenger ashore to scout cautiously about. A messenger was also sent to the Zamarin to announce that Vasco da Gama, Captain General of the fleet, had come bearing a message from the King of Portugal to be delivered with his own hand. The Zamarin replied with a formal message of welcome and granted him an interview. On May 28th, an hour before sunset, Vasco da Gama, elegantly attired in a brown satin coat, white satin breeches, blue velvet tunic, and cap with a white plume, was entering the royal palace of the Zamarin, accompanied by 12 of his officers. They had traveled all day to get there, carried in litters borne by relays of 6 men along the road to the city. The way had been lined with men, women, and children, curious to see the foreigners. The first place they visited in the city was a Hindu temple. Being completely ignorant of the Hindu religion, the Portuguese thought it was a Christian church, even though they were mildly surprised to see some of the saints shown with 4 or 5 arms. Each officer carried a present for the Zamorin: pieces of scarlet material, a gilded mirror, 50 silk caps, and 50 gilded cases containing Flemish knives. These were sent in ahead to the Zamorin, who was amazed and scornful of them. That king must be poor indeed to send such modest gifts as these. The poorest merchant from Mecca, sneered one of his Arab counselors, would give more. One of the Portuguese kept a diary of this journey to India, in which he described this first meeting between East and West. The Zamorin was found seated in a vast hall under a white canopy, reclining on a green divan covered with rich silks. He was naked to the waist, from which a white garment reached to his knees. On his left arm he wore an armband, richly set with precious stones. A diamond the size of a thumb hung from the central bangle. About his neck the king wore a double string of pearls, which reached to his waist, each pearl the size of a hazelnut. Above this was a thin, round gold chain, with a heart-shaped pendant surrounded by large pearls and covered with a mass of rubies. In the middle of it was a green stone as large as a bean. This precious stone, the diamond and the armband, and a pearl fastened to the Zamorin's hair, belonged to the ancient treasures of the kings of Calicut. Close to the king stood a little boy. He carried a red shield decorated in gold and a short sword. On the other side a page had a copious golden basin into which the king would spit. Next to his chair there stood a high Brahmin, who from time to time would hand the king a green leaf enveloping other objects, and the king would chew at it continuously and then spit it into the basin and start on a fresh one. The king made not the slightest motion as Vasco da Gama entered, except to nod to the Brahmin, who took da Gama's hand and led him to his master. Gama joined his hands in the Indian manner which he had observed, and made a profound obeisance. The Zamorin bowed ever so slightly, touched da Gama's hand with the tip of his fingers, and bade him to be seated on the dais below his couch. Gama remained standing, and addressed him through his interpreter. "Most powerful sire, most powerful ruler of India, the great King of Portugal, my master has heard of your greatness, the fame of which girdles the earth, and is desirous of making a treaty of friendship with you as a brother. He has therefore sent his ships with wares of his own country to dispose of it in yours, and desires to acquire especially pepper and spices, which are not found in Portugal." The interpreter hesitated to repeat the king's answer. "You say you have come from a great king, yet the gifts you have brought me from your king are of trifling value." Vasco da Gama replied to this with a lie. The 3 ships were but a small part of the great fleet sent by the King of Portugal. He said that others bearing great gifts had been wrecked in a storm. The king would send goods of such value as to buy everything in the markets of Calicut. He then kissed the letter from Dom Manuel and presented it to the Zamorin, who pressed it against his breast as a sign of love and promised a future audience. On leaving, da Gama took away gifts from the Zamorin worth 1,000 times more than the modest gifts he had brought. Plotting against the intruder, the Arab merchants meanwhile had bribed the head officer of the Zamorin to seize and hold Vasco da Gama. Da Gama told him if he did not set him free, all the ships in the harbor of Calicut would be sunk and the whole city destroyed. This insolent threat was reported to the Zamorin at once with the advice that the Portuguese be put to death. The great Brahmin intervened. "My lord, do not do that," he said. "You have no reason for it. The stranger has, so far, done no harm." Vasco da Gama felt fortunate in having escaped death and in being allowed to load his ships with spices before he departed. The real riches of the Orient, he learned, lay still farther east in what were called the Spice Islands. But he dared not undertake the voyage with his depleted crew. The journey home was slow, with more dreadful scurvy. Soon half of his men were dead. Without enough sailors left to man 3 ships, the St. Raphael had to be abandoned. It was late in the summer of 1499, 2 years after they had started, that the weather-beaten St. Gabriel and the Berrio were again anchored in the harbor of Lisbon. King Manuel received Vasco da Gama with great ceremony in the presence of the whole court, and made him Admiral of the Sea of India. The king also fulfilled his vow to replace the small chapel where da Gama and his men had prayed the night before their great voyage, with one in memory of Prince Henry. The monks were charged with the obligation to offer their prayers for the soul of Prince Henry, founder of the original chapel, and of the monarch and his successors. A gold coin was struck to commemorate the voyage which had opened the sea route to India. For nearly 400 years, until the opening of the Suez Canal, this way opened by Portugal was to be the route from Europe to the Far East. On May 30th, 1498, Columbus started on his 3rd voyage. Neither he nor anyone else in Europe knew that just 10 days earlier, on May 20th, Vasco da Gama had landed in Calicut and the Portuguese had reached India. It was known, however, that the King of Portugal believed that a mainland existed south of the islands which Columbus had discovered, and might soon be searching for it. The admiral's purpose on this voyage was to find whether that mainland did exist, and if so, whether it lay west of the dividing line and could therefore be claimed for Spain. Columbus was far from well, suffering severely from arthritis, as he left Seville for the port of embarkation at the mouth of the river. "I departed," he wrote, "in the name of the Most Holy Trinity from the town of San Lucar, very wearied. I had hoped to rest there, but my pain had doubled. I navigated to the island of Madeira, from there to the Canary Islands, where I departed with 1 ship and 2 caravels. I sent the other ships on the direct course to the island of Hispaniola to take supplies to the new fort which Bartholomew had built. Having reached the islands of Cape Verde, I sailed southward 480 miles. There the wind failed me, and I came into great heat, so intense that I believed that the ships and people would be burned. The heat lasted for 8 days, and it pleased our Lord at the end of these 8 days to give me a favorable wind, and I steered westward. On Tuesday, July 31st, at midday, land appeared to us. A sailor went up the maintop to look out, and to the westward saw 3 mountains near to one another. We repeated the Salve Regina and other prayers, and we all gave many thanks to our Lord. This, then, was Trinidad. Columbus had vowed to name the first island he reached for the Trinity. What could be more suitable than that this island, blessed with 3 peaks, should be given that holy name? Passing through a narrow strait which he called the Serpent's Mouth, he entered the gulf and crossed to what he thought was another island, but which was actually a point of the mainland. There, on Sunday, a little to the west along the southern coast of the peninsula, men from the ship went ashore, the first Spaniards ever to set foot on the American continent. It was August 5th, 1498. After searching for the end of the island, they reported to Columbus at evening, when they returned to the ship, that they had found 4 rivers feeding streams of fresh water into the Gulf. What could this mean? What 4 rivers could they be? Columbus was exhausted, too tired to think, too ill to carry on with the exploration. Also, he felt he should get to Bartholomew and Hispaniola. So he turned about and left the Gulf through the narrow strait to the north of Trinidad, which he called the Mouth of the Dragons, and sailed on to the west. When they had sailed west farther than the depth of the Gulf, and still found no end to the island, it dawned on Columbus that what they had found had not been an island, but a continent. That night of August 15th, he wrote in his journal, "I believe that this is a very great continent, which until today has been unknown, and reason aids me greatly because of that so great river and fresh water sea." But what continent was it? Where and how did it fit into the geography of the world as it was then known? Where in the world had he heard of 4 rivers before? It came to him. Genesis. Did it not say, "And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became 4"? This, then, must be paradise on earth, the continent on which was located the Garden of Eden. Surely this was the place to form the next settlement, later, after he had been to Hispaniola. For now he was desperate to get to the fort where he could rest and relieve the pain in his eyes. Never, he said, had his eyes been so injured, nor did they run blood and cause so much pain as now. Santo Domingo, the new fort that Bartholomew had built, was named for the patron saint of their father. It had a fine harbor, and was far better, Columbus saw, in every way than the old fort of Isabella. But the behavior of the men had grown worse, and there was no chance for him to rest. The Chief Justice, whom he had appointed to act during his absence, had led a rebellion against Bartholomew, and he and his men were now roaming the island. Columbus sent his flagship home at once, with 2 letters to Ferdinand and Isabella, one describing a very great continent which he had found, including maps and charts. The other asked that they send a new Chief Justice to the island. Both letters had unexpected consequences. Almost as soon as the ship sailed, the Chief Justice who had rebelled offered to make peace, though on humiliating terms. Columbus was so exhausted and so eager for peace that he accepted the offer. That was barely settled when he heard that the former rebel, Hoeda, who had gone back to Spain, had now returned and landed somewhere on the island. Men were sent to locate the invader, but Hoeda escaped, sailed away to the Bahama Islands, where he loaded up with slaves and returned to Spain with a description of what he had discovered. For Hoeda had now become an explorer, one of the many, eager for glory and gold, who were already following in the wake of Columbus. After Columbus's flagship had returned to Spain with his letter announcing the new continent, Hoeda had managed to get hold of the admiral's charts and also to obtain a license to make a voyage of exploration to this Garden of Eden. Hoeda had discovered rich pearl fisheries near the island which Columbus had named Margarita for Margaret of Austria, and then passed on by in his haste to get to Santo Domingo, missing the valuable pearls. Following along the mainland, Hoeda had given the first European name to a country in South America. The natives whom he saw lived in huts built on piles out into the water, which reminded him of Venice. So he called the country Little Venice, or Venezuela. In the summer of 1500 came the crowning disaster for Columbus. The new Chief Justice he had asked for had arrived. In answer to his letter, the sovereigns had appointed an officer named Bobadilla, who was not only overly endowed with Spanish pride, but happened to arrive at a most inopportune time. Columbus, who was usually weak in discipline, had been driven to desperation, and had just hanged 7 Spanish rebels. As soon as Bobadilla's ship entered the harbor, and he saw those 7 dead bodies dangling from the gallows, his proud Spanish blood boiled. He strode ashore to settle with that dastardly Italian. As viceroy, he took immediate possession of the fort and began issuing orders right and left. He threw Columbus in jail, loaded him with chains, did the same to Bartholomew and Diego, and sent all 3 back for trial on the first ship leaving Santo Domingo for Spain. As soon as they put to sea, the skipper, who had come to know Bobadilla's malice, offered to remove his chains, but the admiral refused. He had been placed in chains in the sovereign's name, he said, and he would wear them until the sovereign ordered them removed, for he was resolved to keep those chains as a memorial of how well he had been rewarded for his many services, and that he wanted them buried with his bones. This is what Ferdinand Columbus later wrote in his book. In Florence, after months of upheaval following the banishment of the Medicis, the monk Savonarola, through a series of political sermons, had made himself the chief power in government. He formed a grand council of over 1,000 members to take the place of the Signoria, or Council of 8, elected to support the Medici. Savonarola had steadfastly refused to join Pope Alexander's league against France. Rather than become an ally of that vile father of the Church, he preferred to rely on the friendship of the French king. The Pope, annoyed by Savonarola's lack of cooperation and his hostility, demanded that the people of Florence either silence the stubborn monk or banish him. The Pope's words fell on deaf ears. The people of Florence could hear nothing but the voice of Savonarola. They were completely under his spell. Convinced of their sin, filled with remorse and a frenzy of repentance, They went to extremes in renouncing all worldly pleasure. Young men became monks and priests. Young women discarded all beauty aids. Botticelli, who had painted gods and goddesses of Greek mythology to celebrate the triumphs of the Medici, now painted only religious themes inspired by the sermons of Savonarola. Life in Florence had become somber. No longer were the narrow streets gay with colorful processions. No more chariots, no more dancers, no more singers making merry as in the ancient festivals of Bacchus. Carnival time of 1497 presented a strange and different scene. Across the piazza of the Palazzo Vecchio came frenzied people, their arms full of carnival masks and masquerade costumes, wigs and tinsel finery, all to be thrown into a huge pile of worldly vanities and burned. Playing cards, dice, false curls, pots of rouge, perfumes, mirrors, jewelry of all kinds were wildly tossed away. Paintings and portraits, statues and piles of books, all were heaped up to feed the flames. Crowds filled the square and also the balcony of the palazzo as the fire was lighted. The clanging of the bronze bell in the tower, the monks chanting, mingled with the crackling flames. The vanities were reduced to a pile of ashes. The frenzy also burned itself out in the somber days that followed. Savonarola, spurred on to further reform by his success in Florence, now raised his voice against the graver evils of Rome, crying out against the sins of priesthood and the corruption of the church. "Thou ribald church," cried Savonarola, "thou art shameless, a monster of abomination. Once anointed priests speak of their sons. O prostitute church, thou hast displayed thy foulness to the whole world, and stinkest unto heaven." Savonarola realized that such tirades aimed at Pope Alexander VI would bring excommunication. But let it come, he said, if need be. He would welcome it. Let it come quickly, O Lord. Let me be persecuted. I beg this grace, O Lord. Let me give my blood for thee. His fervent prayer for martyrdom did not go unanswered. The righteous monk might cry out against the sins of the people, but not those of the priest and the pope. In castigating Rome, his preaching had gone beyond the proper limits. Even in Florence, reaction set in. Days were too joyless to be endured any longer. The Signoria, enemies of Savonarola, regained control of the government. They forbade him to preach any longer in the cathedral or churches of Florence. On May 13, 1497, Pope Alexander VI excommunicated Savonarola, but offered to rescind the decree if the friar would come to Rome, and if Florence would join the league against France. Savonarola not only refused, he wrote to the kings of Europe, begging them to call a general council and reform the church. The Lord, he said, had commanded him to do so. He was a prophet speaking for the Lord, saying, "Cleanse my church." A prophet of the Lord indeed. That was too much for the rival order of Franciscans. They denounced the Dominicans and their friar, calling him a false prophet and a heretic. They challenged the monk to a medieval trial by fire in the piazza, in which the truth of the conflicting views were to be proved by seeing whether he or the Franciscan could walk unhurt through the flames. A huge crowd of spectators gathered for the spectacle and went away in a rage of disappointment when the show did not come off. This was due to a long argument between the two orders, but the crowd turned against Savonarola as if he alone were to blame. as if by cowardice he had proved himself guilty. 2 days later, at the Dominican monastery of San Marco, Savonarola was presented with a summons to appear before the Signoria and give himself up. The friars would not let him go. When troops came to take him, they defended him bravely with swords and clubs until Savonarola bade them to lay down their arms. Standing by the altar, he calmly waited to be taken. In the evening, with another loyal friar, he was led off to the palazzo, while mobs laughed and jeered and spat at them. The 2 monks were put into cells and tortured day after day in the approved manner of the Inquisition. Messengers from the Pope kept urging the Signoria to wring a confession out of Savonarola that would give reason for putting him to death. After 3 terrible ordeals by torture, the exhausted monk signed whatever they asked him to confess, that he had lied, that he had not been divinely inspired, that he had urged foreign powers to call a council and depose the Pope. On those grounds, Savonarola was condemned to death. On May 23, 1498, Savonarola and 2 other Dominicans in long white robes were led from the cells of the Palazzo Vecchio to the same spot in the piazza where the vanities had been burned the year before. There the people of Florence watched while the man who had once been their idol was hanged to death, and his body burned to ashes. The ashes were thrown into the Arno River for fear that they might later be recognized and revered as those of a saint. But no pope was ever to award the crowning glory of sainthood to this critic of the Church who spoke up at a time when his warning should have been heeded. It was too late now to avoid disaster.